With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
The strategy, simply put, is to denigrate, undermine Western powers on the world stage, particularly the United States, and to throw grit in its gears in terms of the working of US democracy. And they certainly seem to have been successful. Russian active measures, covert action, disinformation being one of those active measures, they are only effective when they build on existing trends or issues or fault lines within target societies.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. Our episode this week is the second in a two-parter with top intelligence historian Calder Walton. Calder is currently the Assistant Director of the Applied History Project at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We're talking about his book SPIES, an epic history of the intelligence wars between East and West. In the first episode, which you mustn't miss, Calder talks about the origins of the intelligence battle between the newly formed Soviet Union and the West, taking us all the way through the Cold War. This time, we're looking at the part intelligence played in the collapse of the Soviet Union. We'll talk Putin, assassinations, and the rising threat of Chinese intelligence. There are some great episodes coming up on Spy Masters. You don't want to miss out. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or follow us on X at the Spy Masters Pod. Now, over to me, talking to Calder. Calder, thank you so much for coming back.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. We left at a very exciting moment in the story of the intelligence relationship between the East and West.
A cliffhanger, we might even say, right?
A cliffhanger, exactly. So we're coming towards the most extraordinary period, the end of the Cold War, which I want to talk about it from two perspectives. One, the perspective of how the intelligence services were involved in the actual process of the Soviet Union collapsing. And two, also, my understanding of it as intelligence failure. Nobody saw it coming on either side, right? And was that a failure of intelligence, or was that just a function of how unexpected it was? So maybe we could get into both those things. But let's start with where we're at on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of the kind of what we've been talking about in the previous episode, which was the sort of asymmetrical but intense intelligence battle between the two sides.
That's right. So, well, the first thing to say is that intelligence, that clandestine intelligence war, if you like, between East and West continued until the very end. And the big revelation for me in the book, and this came from records, some of which were only declassified in 2022, British cabinet records, Foreign Office records, and so on, is that actually, although the Soviet Union unwound and then collapsed between 1989 and 1991, in fact, Russia's intelligence services continued on essentially as the same beasts, but under different names. So, contrary to what appeared to be the case in the West, when Western commentators famously were talking about the end of history and the last man, Francis Fukuyama's famous or infamous phrase, which he sort of heralded, that liberal democracy looked to be triumphant on the world stage, things look very, very different from the position of the Kremlin. Russian policymakers, now that Russia was its own country, unshackled as they saw it by the Soviet Union, Russian nationalists saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, a humiliation for Russia. Russia went from being a superpower in the body of the Soviet Union to being in no way even a great power, let alone a middle-ranking power, all very quickly in the space of 2 years. So actually, one thread of the book, which builds on my earlier research of the collapse of the British Empire, is that Russia experienced the process of decolonization, end of empire, like other European powers, but it happened in 2 short years. So unlike the British, unlike the French, that it was a long, protracted process. In many ways, we might want to say, without straying into contemporary British politics, has Britain ever really come to terms with its loss of empire? And that's decades after we can sort of point to key pivotal moments of Britain's end of empire. But all of this happened in a flash with Russia. So it's little wonder that Russian policymakers and indeed Russian nationalists experienced what I think has been rightly called something like a phantom limb syndrome, that suddenly their limb had been cut off. So that's the broad context. To get to your first question of, was it an intelligence failure to forecast the unwinding and then eventual ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, we can point in the direction, as I try to in the book, in the direction of some strategic forecasts from the US intelligence community, highlighting that there were systemic problems. These forecasts were in the late 1980s, really analyzing Gorbachev's reforms of the Soviet Union and saying whether they were really adequately reforming it, or whether indeed the system was reformable. And they said that the conclusions was that the Gorbachev reforms were not changing the nature of the beast, and that there were systemic problems. So if you like, the US intelligence community was correct in forecasting at a strategic level that the Soviet Union had systemic problems which one day might lead to its collapse. But you're absolutely right, as your question implied, that nobody in the West, so far as I knew, no agency, nor, it should be said, Kremlin leaders, nor the Soviet intelligence community forecast the sort of the escalation of events that led to the unwinding of the Soviet bloc and then the Soviet Union itself. These were events driven from below, not from above.
One of the things that you have in your book, which I thought was really interesting, was just before it all unraveled, Gorbachev was actually trying to reform the intelligence service as part of his wider kind of package of reforms. I love the detail that they had like a Miss KGB program to try and make the KGB look more accessible.
It was a bit more trying to make it a bit more touchy-feely. We're not really the bad guys. And Gorbachev's attempts to reform the sycophantic intelligence reporting, saying, I don't just want to have intelligence reports that confirm what you think I want to hear. I actually want to hear dissenting voices. But let's be honest, the entire system was such that, I mean, the KGB for the previous 6-7 decades had been essentially in the business of telling Soviet leaders exactly that, what they wanted to hear, rather than dissenting opinions like in the Western counterparts.
It was interesting you talk about the continuity between pre-collapse and post-collapse of the intelligence service of the KGB, because can you have an effective one-party state with a touchy-feely security service, or was it not touchy-feely? Were they just paying lip service to Gorbachev's reforms? I mean, how did the KGB itself fit into the collapse?
Well, so the KGB hardliners would, after the event, essentially blame everything on Gorbachev, saying that they, the KGB, were trying their best to produce accurate reporting, but the entire Soviet system was betrayed by Gorbachev. And that narrative is directly picked up by a junior mid-level KGB officer at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse, Vladimir Putin, who then in the mid to late 1990s shot up the ranks, became the director of the FSB, and then became Yeltsin's successor at the end of the decade. So the KGB, after the event, tried to claim that they were correctly forecasting the collapse. Whether they really were is really up for debate. The fragmentary evidence that we have suggests that they were not, that they were still in the business of telling Gorbachev and key decision makers that everything will be fine. That one final head of KGB analysis said right to the bitter end that the working ethos within the KGB was blame everything on the Americans and everything will be fine. And that continued straight through. The messy aftermath of the collapse and how the KGB was resurrected into a different guise is really an interesting story. And my own research using records and interviews picks up on the excellent work of Catherine Belton, Putin's People. And her work was really pioneering, came out a couple years ago, that book. The Cabinet Office records and British Foreign Office records show how even in by 1991, 92, officials at the British Embassy in Moscow were warning that although the KGB had been officially disbanded, little has actually changed. And then this is picked up directly in some interviews I did, particularly with one FSB defector to the United States, who was trained and worked in the FSB in the mid to late 1990s. He comes from a family of KGB. He was born into it. So he was in many ways a true believer, but was shocked at what he saw in terms of the systemic corruption within the FSB in the late 1990s. Anyway, he said he shared with me the anecdote that in the mid 1990s, when he was undergoing training, they still used the same KGB training manuals in the FSB, but now that they just had the ideological bits about communism ripped out. So basically they were saying, don't worry about that bit on Marxism and Leninism. We're still going to use the same principles. So this is really the story of how, and it's just an extraordinary historical example of where there is this remarkable continuity despite an outward revolution. So revolutions, as we know, first and foremost, it appears they sweep away things, but quite quickly, history shows they become true revolutions, meaning turning back, revolving, going back. And there is a straight continuity with the KGB through to the Russian foreign intelligence, the SVR today, and the quote-unquote domestic security service, the FSB.
But that's quite an interesting point, given that the other theme that you pick up in this period is the fact that the US and British intelligence services actually begin to pull away from focusing on Russia. And yet, at the same time, you're saying that at a higher level, you know, in the Foreign Office, etc., they knew that there was a continuity, but the intelligence services decided to opt for a different tack. Why?
It's the difference between some voices that became strikingly prophetic in hindsight from the British Embassy and then actual policy. And there was, as you said, just this massive dismantling of US and UK intelligence capabilities focusing on Russia in the 1990s. I mean, the US, the CIA's Office of Former Soviet Affairs was slashed and decimated. This is the period of the so-called peace dividend. The Cold War is over. We don't need intelligence apparatus and bureaucracies trained on the former Soviet bloc. All of that can be consigned to history. Sure, there were some small, relatively small resources still trained on Russia, but the overwhelming focus was forecasting, and there were some discussions here in the US of disbanding the CIA altogether, that it had served its purpose. It was set up in 1947. It no longer, its primary focus was on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, so what's the point of the CIA? So that was not a heretical view in Washington in the early 1990s.
There's an eerie echo then of that kind of combination of exhaustion and naivety that you actually got at the end of the Second World War, right?
That's exactly it. And then what I see primarily through interviewing US intelligence officers and a few British intelligence officers, although the culture of British intelligence is much different from the US intelligence, meaning that it's generally more difficult to get interviews out of people, at least on the record. Anyway, there's a really striking parallel, it seems to me, with 9/11 and the aftermath, and the intelligence resources that governments on both sides of the Atlantic threw towards countering terrorism. And the earlier period that we talked about in the first part of the podcast about the Second World War and the overwhelming intelligence priority of the Western allies geared towards defeating the Axis powers. So this was a moment when there was in the Second World War, an existential crisis. Post 9/11, we can query whether there was really an existential crisis for the US, as horrific as the events of 9/11 were. But certainly the overwhelming national security focus was on counterterrorism. And that trickled across the Atlantic as well. In 2006, this is a striking, chilling statistic. 2006, the same year when Putin probably sanctioned the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London, which your listeners will probably remember, if they're old enough, with polonium poisoning. That same year, MI5's work was 95% focused on counterterrorism, 5% left over on all hostile states: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. So there is a striking imbalance there, which in the cold light of day now, and in retrospect, we can see that this was a golden opportunity for Russia and China to go on the offensive while defenses were down and Western security was focused elsewhere.
And you make it very clear in the book that go on the offensive is what they did. I mean, let's talk briefly about Putin. You referenced him earlier as a sort of middle-ranking KGB operative at the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, lots has been written about how formative that was for him. One of the things I found very fascinating in your book was your description of him turning the FSB, the Domestic Security Organization, into basically a kind of private mafia army. Can you? Yeah. How does that happen?
Absolutely. Well, it's important, I think, to understand that the Kremlin's narrative today under Putin, indeed it started even before Putin, actually started in the Soviet period, but then bled over in the 1990s, and then it's continued under Putin, is that the KGB in the past and Russia's intelligence services today are highly professionalized services, with directly comparable to Western services, MI6 and the CIA, that there's a professionalism there. As far as SPIES is concerned, that's a complete misnomer, a complete load of nonsense. The FSB was and continues to be an instrument for massive state-driven organized crime, and particularly money laundering, for Putin himself and for Russia's oligarchs. All of this started in this really grubby period in the early 1990s, when Putin had left the KGB. Apparently he was working as a taxi driver for a while, but he then got a job in the regional government of St. Petersburg, working, I think, as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And this brought him headlong into association with and cooperation with the Russian mafia. St. Petersburg was the home of Russian organized crime, Russia's gangland, as it was called, and his role in the provincial government in St. Petersburg meant that he, by necessity, had to deal with the Russian mafia. And sure enough, some of the companies that he established in order to do things, apparently for Leningraders, were fronts organizations for Russian organized crime. This is important in and of itself, but it becomes even more important then when Putin becomes the director of the FSB in 1998, because he brings with him those connections from organized crime into the FSB. And then when he becomes Yeltsin's successor in 1999, that merger of former KGB officers, Russia organized crime, and now the Kremlin are fused together in this extraordinarily toxic mix. So I think that what I try to do in these chapters of the book is really correct the misnomer that Russia's intelligence services are, as I said, professionalized services comparable to Western services. The rot within the FSB is not just something of like a few bad apples. It's everybody is on the take. Corruption within the FSB is such that if you're not on the take as an FSB officer, you'll stand out like a sore thumb. And that is actually the vehicle that allows Putin to dispense with any enemies. Because if everybody's on the take, then it's very easy to just say to someone, this person's being arrested for corruption. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Very similar, it should be added to the way that the Chinese Communist Party operates, where corruption is so systemic that it allows China's leader today, Xi Jinping, to get rid of enemies by pointing towards corruption, because everybody's corrupt.
As you were saying before, the West is kind of looking elsewhere, but
Yep.
Putin's intelligence campaigns against the West pick up pace, get more extreme. I mean, you're brilliantly interesting on the disinformation stuff. Could you just talk us through some of
absolutely.
that?
So I think that it would probably be useful to situate Putin's campaigns at this period in the early 2000s. It's not necessarily against the West as so much against his political enemies, political dissidents. So that's where Litvinenko and so on come into play in his elimination, assassination of political opponents, beginning very early on. So Putin's grand strategy is clearly to solidify and to bring security to his own rule. First and foremost, it's about his own personal rule. But lurking in the background, and then it becomes increasingly more visible, is his, as one CIA officer who had met Putin in the early 1990s told me, his visible hatred of the United States from that early period in the 1990s becomes increasingly clear in the early 2000s. And each step that the US makes simply confirms Putin's worst fears about what the United States is doing, trying to encircle Russia, using NATO as a proxy to wage a campaign against Russian civilization. These are all hard-right nationalist narratives that existed in Russian politics from that early period under Putin, and they've only become louder and louder since then. So it's a perfect marriage of disaster, if you like, of every step Western powers, the US, takes, confirms all the worst fears, as Putin sees it, about what they're doing. NATO expansion, enlargement of the EU, and so on. This is all just fanning the flames of Putin's fears about Western encirclement. then we get to the transformation of the information ecospace, if you like, with the development of social media. So Facebook, Twitter, other ones that came and went from that early period. And this is Putin, you have to hand it to him, and his intelligence services were ahead of everybody else on this, seeing actually how their long-term strategies and tactics of disinformation right from the earliest period of the Soviet period could be adapted and weaponized in this new environment of social media. And the high point, or the low point, if you like, of that was Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election, which was an operation straight out of the KGB's past. In the book, I try to show actually how Soviet disinformation, in particular Soviet interference, meddling in US presidential elections, goes back a long way, all the way back to 1948. But the advent of social media was really a game changer for all of this compared to the past. It just meant that disinformation was able to travel more quickly. They were able to do these operations more efficiently, more cheaply, and arguably more effectively than ever before in history. So that was the real game changer. And we're seeing new iterations of this same strategy. The strategy, simply put, is to denigrate, undermine Western powers on the world stage, particularly the United States, and to throw grit in its gears in terms of the working of US democracy. And they certainly seem to have been successful. But it's absolutely the thing that I want to stress is that what the KGB noticed in the past, what they correctly observed in the past, and what is still the case today, is that Russian active measures, covert action, disinformation being one of those active measures, they are only effective when they build on existing trends or issues or fault lines within target societies. So Russian and Soviet intelligence in the past exploited grievances in the US society, particularly about race relations, for example, and that's just the same as it is today. They're sort of opening the wounds that we've already made for ourselves. So I think that we need to be very careful about depicting Putin as this master puppeteer who can kind of manipulate public opinion at will. It's really what he's building on are our own problems within our societies.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. Black Friday Game Day on Prime is an epic day of live sports. It all starts at 9 a.m. Eastern with the Capital One Skins game. Then, Black Friday football returns when the Bears take on the Eagles at 3 p.m. And it culminates with the final night of Emirates NBA Cup Group play with Bucks Knicks at 7 p.m. and Mavs Lakers at 10 p.m. Black Friday Game Day, only on Prime.
The Lincoln Wishlist sales event is happening now. Here's what's on everyone's wish list. Enjoying holiday jingles with brilliant 3D audio that surrounds you? Check. Watching snow flurries through the panoramic Vista roof? Check. Packing up presents with the spacious Lincoln Splitgate? Check. Everything you want. All standard on the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV. Visit your local Lincoln retailer or learn more at Lincoln.com for exceptional offers on 2025 Lincoln vehicles today.
One of the more kind of, visible and traditional intelligence moments of the last couple of years, though, I guess, is it feels like less of a win for Putin than the disinformation campaign, which, as you know, I absolutely take your point, but it does sometimes feel like an onslaught. But with regard to Ukraine, there was a sort of visible moment where Western intelligence trumped Russian intelligence, right? Because we predicted that the invasion was coming. We made the very interesting decision to go public on that rather than just having conversations behind the scenes. And meanwhile, Putin's intelligence on Ukraine had completely led him in the wrong direction. Was this just down to the individual intelligence, or is this a kind of systemic issue with the way Putin runs things that means that he was more vulnerable in that moment than we were?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I see trends, continuities, and threads between earlier systemic intelligence failures on the part of the Kremlin, thinking of Stalin's mishandling of intelligence before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and Putin's mishandling of intelligence before the war in Ukraine. We don't know. It should big caution here. We don't have the records. We don't have, as of yet, a public defector who can tell us exactly what was going on. But it seems blindingly clear that Putin was acting as his own intelligence analyst, who thought that he, after all, with his KGB background, thought that he knew how to analyze intelligence better than his own services. And when a service would be so bold as to give him a more sober assessment of what might happen in Ukraine, well, we saw that in Putin's National Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion, where he humiliated the director of Russia's foreign intelligence, the SVR, Sergei Narishkin. What was going on there? My guess is that perhaps Narishkin's service, the SVR, had given a more sober assessment of chances of success. So there's a sort of systemic problem there with Putin's use of intelligence about Ukraine. But you're absolutely quite right, is that lying in sharp contrast to that is how the US and the British intelligence communities correctly forecast Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Many European allies didn't believe that intelligence, and neither did Zelensky himself, apparently. And then, as you said, there was this bold decision, not unprecedented. US intelligence, CIA had gone public with intelligence about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, about Soviet missiles there. So there are precedents for disclosure of intelligence, but this was happening at really an extraordinary quick real time. And it was, I think it's fair to say, successful in that it ultimately galvanized support for Ukraine. It was unsuccessful in that, of course, it didn't deter Putin's invasion, but it may well have been successful in that it derailed his initial strategy, and in particular preempted some of the so-called false flags, pretexts that he was preparing to use in order to concoct excuses for an invasion. Things like, the pretext was things like would be discovering a US plot to meddle in Russian politics. He was rescuing, all that he would be trying to do was to rescue ethnic Russians from Ukrainian subversion and Western subversion. So a lot of parallels, actually, it strikes me as that this is a useful thread to pull at, would be to analyze the false flags and the pretexts for Hitler's invasion of Poland in the beginning of the Second World War and Putin's similar narratives about Ukraine. It's the same, it's really striking, very similar strategies about how you couch an invasion as a form of sort of forward defense, defending ethnic Germans or Russians, as the case may be.
On the subject of terrifying continuities, you end your book with a I found quite chilling assessment of Chinese intelligence. I'm going to quote you. You say, like Soviet intelligence during the last century, Chinese agencies are waging a persistent, integrated and asymmetric onslaught on Western countries. That's quite right. A statement.
That's right. It is, interviewing Western intelligence officers about what they're seeing on a day-to-day level. Chinese intelligence operations are on a scope and scale that make the past, the Soviets, for example, during the Cold War, look like kindergarten. It's across domains. The starting point is to say that the Chinese Communist Party has a very different conception of intelligence than Western countries do. It's not necessarily about stealing secrets. It's just about collecting information. Some of that information might be secret, classified. Some of it is just open. It's about collection of data, of information, and then processing that data. And sure, there are elements of traditional espionage in terms of the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence apparatus. You know, you don't have to go far picking up the newspapers today to read about potential Chinese honey traps in which they, you know, recruit an agent or find a compromising material over somebody in the West with access to classified information, through to cyber hackings and attacks. I mean, this is spilling out day to day in the newspapers and news outlets. But then there's just a much broader way in which the CCP is collecting information from universities, from think tanks, and so on. There's a really broader grey scope, and it's going to, unfortunately, raise some really ugly questions for Western governments. There's newspapers in the last week or so that in the UK that MI5 is likely going to have to get involved with security checks on researchers at universities doing specifically sensitive types of research. There's going to inevitably be really uncomfortable discussions, public policy discussions about people entering into the civil service in the UK who happen to be of Chinese heritage or descent. This is going to raise, as I said, civil liberties and the need for security in a really difficult way going forward.
I think it's the scale of it that comes across in your book for why this is such an urgent issue. I mean, and also the slight difference in flavour. You talk about the fact that there's a integration between national security and commerce with the Chinese government. So this is new, all quite sinister.
That's absolutely right. Is that the fundamental difference between the Cold War, what we could call Cold War I, was that the Soviet Union was never an economic player on the world stage. It was essentially a pariah. And that is definitely not the case with China today, which is completely integrated into the world economy. And Chinese businesses, commerce, are under an obligation to work with Chinese intelligence services. This is under the new national security laws passed under Xi Jinping, in a way that is without comparison to their Western counterparts. So there's a fusion between intelligence security in the CCP and business. And it's within this context that people are so alarmed about things like Huawei and TikTok. My own view on TikTok is that anybody with a phone or with anybody that has access to any government sensitive or classified information definitely shouldn't have a TikTok account on their phone. And the US Congress at the moment is pushing to get it banned. I think that that's an overreach. And I think that my own view is that if people want to have TikTok on their phones, they should be eyes wide open into what it is, which is it can be used effectively as a collection platform by the Chinese Communist Party, but banning it from people who don't have access to sensitive information seems like a massive overreach from my perspective.
Calder, I think my children are going to massively regret me talking to you because they've all got TikTok and no longer. But I think for the listeners...
Well, as long as they don't have access to any state secrets on their phone, I think we're fine.
Yeah, not yet.
But it does... The thing about TikTok is as long as there isn't any... there aren't any secrets, commercial secrets. I mean, that will be up to that will be within the purview of your employer and the commercial secrets you have on your phone. But certainly any state secrets, you shouldn't have a TikTok account on that phone. But if we ultimately do live in free societies, and if you want to have the right to upload stupid dance videos onto TikTok, I think that's your right. That's my own view.
It might be all right. I just still wish they wouldn't. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolutely brilliant tour de force. Episode 2 as stellar as episode 1. So thank you very much. And I will urge again people to buy your book because it's brilliant.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Look forward to joining you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you for listening to the Spy Masters podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.